most been looking forward to across the political conferences this year. We're going to discuss Labour's desire to see 70% of households owning their own home in the UK. It's a fascinating commitment because it is a deliberate and ambitious effort to park tanks on the Conservative Party lawn and to seize the identity of being the party of home ownership from the Conservatives. Just a few, I'll do some ground rules and do some introductions and then try and launch into speeches straight away. To my left, we have Hazel Blears, who is former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in the Brown government between 2007 and 2009. Neil Jefferson, to my right, is the Managing Director for the Home Builders Federation, and the HBF are kindly sponsoring this event today. To Neil's right, we have Rachel Cunliffe, a political journalist and broadcaster, and currently the Associate Political Editor at the New Statesman. And to Hazel's left, we have Chris Worrell, who is an Executive Committee member for the Labour Housing Group and was responsible for coordinating the LHG's written submission for the long-term delivery of social and affordable rented housing inquiry held by the government recently. I want this to be a fairly fluid, ranging discussion about Labour's philosophical and moral position on private home ownership, how this fits in with its commitment to expanding social and affordable housing, and also how all of these principled positions actually might be practically delivered. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of the speakers up to 5 minutes to speak on the subject. Then I'll get a discussion going on the panel, and then I'll open up to the floor quite quickly. But I just wanted to say a few things at the outset, because this is of an area of particular interest to Policy Exchange. We've been doing some research recently into attitudes in the main political parties in the UK about ownership. And there's a strong intellectual tradition on the left that is seen spreading private property, and particularly home ownership, as a key strategy for delivering a more equal Britain. This case was made in particular by a revisionist in the Labour Party in the 50s and 60s, people like James Mead and Anthony Crosland. Indeed, the latter, Crosland, said that the ideal of a property-owning democracy, this ideal that we associate, I suppose, with Thatcher and Eden and Churchill, should be a socialist, quote, rather than a conservative ideal, so long as the property is well distributed. And more recently, the previous Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy, said that, quote, the biggest and most consequential divide in Britain today is between the people and communities who have assets, and particularly homes, and those who don't. So the discussion we're about to have is not only timely and topical, it's one that fits firmly into a very established intellectual tradition on the left. And with all that said, if it's all right, Hazel, I'm going to pass over to you to kick us off this morning.
Lovely, thanks very much, and great to see so many people in the room. I was just thinking, in my role as Community Secretary, I used to always think that, you know, there are some basic needs that people have, and the first one is a home, somewhere to live that's warm and clean, you hope. The second one is a job, if you've got a job which hopefully pays you a decent wage. And again, if you enjoy it, then that's icing on the cake. And the third thing I think that most people need is someone to share their life with. And I used to think, well, maybe we could do something about the homes. We could certainly try and expand employment, but I didn't know whether I could set up a social enterprise dating agency or something like that, so that we could fulfill the third requirement for a happy and fulfilled life. I haven't quite got there yet, but it's still in my mind. But where we are at the moment, I think, is pretty dire, if you look at it. Public concern about housing is about the highest level for 40 years, you know. Not just have you got, do you own your own home, but in housing generally, the ability to have a home. We've not been building any new affordable homes. Numbers have fallen to the lowest level in 25 years. And home ownership has actually fallen to a 30-year low. You know, these are dire figures, because you're right, you know, home ownership is very often a platform to people being able to move on to other things. And the number of people sleeping rough on our streets has doubled, and since 2010, fewer new homes have been built since the 1920s. You know, that we can't be living in a kind of forward-looking progressive democracy if that's the situation we've ended up in at the present deal. So the party's been working on a new deal for homes, and I would urge you to read it. You know, policy documents are not always the most exciting thing to do over your breakfast, but I've read the New Deal package, and actually it's really quite inspiring. It's probably a bit aspirational, see if we can actually deliver everything that's in there, but it's certainly wide-ranging, and it goes to the very heart of that bit about a job, a home, and a decent place to live. So there's going to be a new department for housing, and that's interesting because when I was Secretary of State, it was communities and housing, and so the housing was a little bit not quite left behind, but it didn't have that status of actually being a department of its own. So there's going to be a new department. There'll be a new deal for first-time buyers, no stamp duty on the first home, making it more accessible. You'll be guaranteed the first choice for new homes in your area if you're local, so there'll be a really big push for local. 100,000 new discounted first buy homes, and this is interesting, prices linked to local average incomes. So not going to people who are just going to parachute in, not be part of the community. So, if you've got local people living there, you actually get the benefit of all of their connections as well. So they'll contribute in terms of social capital as much as they do in terms of buying the house itself. Stop leaseholders being ripped off. A homeowner guarantee to pay the mortgage if you lose your job. How often does it happen that somebody, through whatever circumstances, might not be their fault, the company goes bust, you lose your job, the next thing you lose is your home. And that's your stability, it's the basis for your family life. 1 million new homes in the next Parliament. I'm sure that the opposition will be keeping us nose to the grindstone and checking us. And 250,000 new homes a year by 2022. 100,000 genuinely affordable homes to rent and buy every year, and the biggest council house building programme in 30 years. New consumer rights for renters, and 3-year tenancies becoming the new norm. I think that's really important because the insecurity of renting causes a whole range of social problems and others. So I've had a really good look at this New Deal. I think it's pretty convincing, and I do take quite a bit of convincing, even from my own party. I think there's going to be an office for housing delivery, and that's going to be like the Office for Budget Responsibility, which I think is a really neat idea. It's going to hold ministers to account for actually delivering all the things that are in the New Deal programme. And if it's an external body, it won't half concentrate minds when they come to do their annual review or whatever, how much progress we've made. So I think that will really help people to do. The other point that I would want to make, and this is close to my heart, is that people don't just live in houses. They live in communities, and I've been very disappointed that a lot of the Section 106 responsibilities developers have actually wriggled out of, and yet those were the things that really give you a quality of life. Leisure facilities, play areas, parks, local shops, transport, new towns and garden cities, encouraging housing co-ops, all of that kind of stuff. And Section 106 was really made to deliver quality of life as well as quality of buildings. And I don't think that it's been really used in the way it could be. And final point, I think this is great. New homes will need to be beautiful. Whoever talks about beauty anymore? And yet, if you're well off and you can afford to live in the countryside, I say that now, I live in Grange-over-Sands, I'm not that well off, but I live in a lovely place. And the theme of beauty, I think, is something politicians don't talk about. They think it's a bit kind of soft and mushy and everything. But actually, if you've got a beautiful home and some garden at least where the children can play, then your quality of life is going to be, hugely improved. The new homes have got to be well connected, designed with local people in mind, good community infrastructure, green space, and communities are going to have a say in where those homes are going to be built. So again, you don't get the NIMBY, not in my backyard, etc., etc. We're all in it together. We're all part of the same community, and you'll get that, dare I say, levelling, not necessarily levelling up, but levelling of people with different backgrounds and different families. But isn't that great that we have that kind of diversity in the communities in which we live? Makes me very proud of our country. So I really like the New Deal for housing. I would urge every single person in the room to get a copy of it off the stalls and really give it a good coat of looking at, because home ownership should not just be for the people who are comfortable, got a good wage, got a good job. Home ownership is the anchor that gives you a stake in your community and means that you can use it as a platform for yourself and your family.
Yeah, home ownership is an anchor. I couldn't have put it better myself. And Hazel's covered so many of the things that make this such a relevant discussion. Home ownership is about security. It's related to the homelessness debate. It's about aspiration, social equity, and we'll get on to beauty in a bit. Rachel, it would be a bit of an understatement to say that this is an issue that you're interested in and have been sometimes more or less angry about on Twitter. So why don't you tell us why?
Thanks, James. So the title of this panel is "How Can Labour Become the Party of Homeownership?" And in true party conference season style, I'm going to answer the question that I wished you'd asked instead, which is why should Labour become the party of homeownership?
It's a better question.
I think it's a useful question to get on to the how. I've got 3 facts here because, as you say, I write about this a lot. I talk about this a lot with varying degrees of anger. Fact 1, in 1989, 51% of 25 to 34-year-olds, just happens coincidentally to be my age range, owned their own home. In 2019, it was 28%, and I think it's gone down since then. So in 30 years, it's not quite halved, but almost. Fact number 2, a third of millennials, coincidentally my generation too, will never be able to buy a home based on current trends. And again, it looks even worse for Generation Z, can we agree on this? Gen Z, below me. And fact 3, in 2021, the average age of a first-time buyer hit 30 in every part of the country, not just a London issue, everywhere. And coincidentally, round about that month, it also emerged that the average age of a first-time mother in this country is also now over 30 for the first time. And there was a lot of panic about that and questions about why could this possibly be? And very few people wanted to join those 2 dots. I think those 3 facts are crucial to understanding a huge range of policy challenges in this country. I don't quite buy into the very Twitter, very online space housing theory of everything, which is that literally everything wrong with this country comes back to housing. But I think a lot of it does. Productivity, jobs, the strains on public services, the shortages in key occupations, the pressures on families, on starting a family, the pressures on communities and the breakdown of family ties because people can't live near their loved ones. I think if you look at housing, and particularly housing for young people and housing security, you could fix an awful lot of the rest of it if you could just get that right. That's why I think Labour should care about it on a policy issue, because there are a lot of challenges and this is the way to really make a start on tackling them. But on an electoral issue, I'm not sure how many people in this room were in Manchester last weekend. You certainly were. I tried to have this conversation there. I tried to have this conversation with a lot of Conservative MPs there, indeed on a panel that I was at, and I pointed out that poll ratings for the Tories are really pretty dire among young people, and housing security for young people is pretty dire, and maybe these things might be connected. And the message I got was, our offering to young people is great. What are you talking about? We're building enough homes. Who's saying that we're not building enough homes? Why aren't young people grateful for all the help that we've given them? But what about right to buy, help to buy, and the lifetime ISA? And I know that housing policy conversations were going on at Conservative Party conference, but they were not going on among key cabinet members who actually have the potential, the powers to do something about this. The Chancellor barely mentioned them. Rishi Sunak didn't mention them in his speech. It is an issue that the Conservatives know they are weak on, but haven't really worked out what to do about it yet, which, if you're the Labour Party looking to inspire a new generation to vote for you their entire lives, I think that's pretty fertile ground. I think there's a real opportunity there. That's the why of why I think it's so important. And I think the idea that the Conservatives are the party of homeownership, the Conservatives are the party of home ownership, is not just a myth anymore. I think it's a relic of the past. If we get on to how, and I hope we'll talk a bit more about how with the other panellists over the course of this, there are lots of policies in terms of working with developers, in terms of how we finance different types of house building, leasehold reform, rental reform, which I think is vital. But fundamentally, it does come down to building more. building the right houses in the right places at the right prices is only possible if you challenge this idea that somebody who already lives in an area has the de facto veto over any changes to that area. One of the things that I do get rather angry about, and did say recently, was this idea that you have the right as a resident and a homeowner to dictate what that area is for all eternity, and that your voice as a homeowner somehow counts more than the voices of all of the people who would love to be residents, love to live in that area, love to contribute and have jobs in that area and pay their taxes and invest in local communities and have children and raise their families, and their voices don't get counted because they're not there already. And that gives whoever the local council or the local MP, and all parties are guilty of this to some extent, but that gives them the right to say our voices count more because we are already here. And if that is your system, nothing will ever change and things will continue to deteriorate. So I think my starting point for how we fix this would be to look at that dynamic and count the voices of the people who could live somewhere too, because we matter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Chris, your Red Brick blog is something I follow very closely, and I love your writing on this topic, so I'd love to turn to you now for your views.
Thanks, James. And it's good to see people like Rachel, who's been quite vociferous on the matter as well, promoting the cause for housing. It's been a matter of much debate. I think many people would see that Labour's recent announcements on housing as a huge positive step change for the party in regards to the direction of travel and how this country can deal with its housing crisis. You know, when we talk about how can Labour become the party of home ownership, it does first need to sort of deal with not being scared of being that party of aspiration. I think under Blair, home ownership levels were high, but there was a lot of mistakes made then as well. I think, you know, when we look at the system that we're under and some of the policy announcements that Hazel's sort of enlightened us with there in the New Deal for housing are interesting. But ultimately, at the heart of this is planning reform. And you know, there's been a Homes for Britain rally yesterday, where the YIMBY movement, the SMI Backyard movement, have you know, heard from a lot of speakers, including Anya Martin, who's on the Policy Exchange panel later on, as well as Andy Weston MP, who's declared himself as the first YIMBY Member of Parliament. And what does that mean? Well, you know, home ownership is the sort of key to tackling wealth inequality, and there's research from the LSE that shows that if your parents are a homeowner, you're more likely to be an owner-occupier yourself. But at the minute, there's over a third of people who are having to rely on the bank of mum and dad, and that bank, I think, as was termed yesterday, is getting stretched. And you know, we have had an ideological battle in the Labour Party. You know, my politics is quite clear of, you know, I'm more amenable to market forces helping us deliver what we need. But the debate can't just be about social housing. We do need social housing. We have one of the highest rates of social housing in Europe, but at the same time, one of the worst housing crises. And, you know, to the point about Anthony Croston and others being a property-only democracy, I think if Labour tackle that, then they are going to be in power for a long, long time, because the reality is that the housing crisis is so acute. We've got leaders of councils living with their parents. We've got councillors, Labour councillors, having moved 6 times in the last 12 months, been asked for 6 months rent up front. It's affecting journalists, it's affecting people that have got professional jobs. And ultimately, it's been ignored for a long time, and I'd like to think that the debate has moved on. And, you know, some people might get a bit upset with me taking umbrage at someone's policy position on whether it's, you know, blocking homes in their area or not. But ultimately, there's been a shift, because the systemic NIMBYism in this country has sort of turned us into a bit of autocracy. And I think Rachel touched on it there, that those voices who need to be heard in the process aren't. And if we are going to move to more of a rules-based system, and, you know, I haven't taken the sort of tough on developer stance and backing the builders as a bit of a conflict from the Labour Party in a sense, but ultimately what's been set out is direction to getting more of a rules-based system. And hopefully that will lead to more housing. And ultimately, yes, they've committed to $1.5 million over 5 years. Heard that from Keir yesterday. But we know from the Centre for Cities research that we've got 4.3 million missing homes. that will require 430 or 1,000 a year over 25 years or whatever it is to get that backlog made. So the commitment for 300,000, in my opinion, it needs to be increased significantly. Otherwise, we will just continue to nibble at the edges.
Great.
Super. Thank you, Chris. And Neil, just to, we've set out, I think, there the political prize on offer and why this is important. You're going to tell us how we can deliver it.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks to all of our panellists for being here today. It's great to see so many people in the audience as well. I think I'm in danger of repeating much of what's just been said, so I'll keep it reasonably short. And certainly Rachel stole a number of my key facts and statistics, but fortunately the numbers I have are the same as yours, so that's always helpful. But I think what we're hearing today is that the prospects for young people, for anybody getting into home ownership, is looking increasingly bleak. And it's, Rachel mentioned about Labour's ambition to increase home ownership to 70%, which is a bold ambition, given that we're currently at 64%. And Rachel set out the statistics, which are pretty bleak for those between the ages of 35 and 45. And also, as Rachel said, the first-time buyer age has really come down as well. The one thing that wasn't covered was actually the issue we have at the other end, which is in fact that the over 65s, a number of which are owner-occupiers, has increased, and those homes are owned outright. And I'll come back to that point towards the end. I think the conclusion that you've got to reach, listening to colleagues on the panel here today, is that the housing market is undoubtedly working for some, maybe who are protecting their interests, but it's not working for others. And the statistics I do have that others maybe don't have is from our own survey, Housing the Nation, and we found that 72% of respondents are worried about the housing prospects of future generations. So although NIMBYism appears to be rife, I think increasingly, and I look across the floor at these types of events and you see people who express concerns. I've just been hearing about a rally that was held yesterday. There is a turning of the tide here. So it's often said that actions speak louder than words. So what does Labour need to do to become or cement itself as being the party of home ownership, as we've discussed today? And what are the barriers that are blocking us? There is no silver bullet, but I'll pick on two areas. One of them has been covered actually by all the speakers, which is about, frankly, just building more homes. But to do that, I think there needs to be a longer-term ambition to increase housing numbers. But believe me, there are many, many barriers which are in the way right now. Going back to our survey, we found that actually 70% of the public believe that building more homes is the key to resolving issues for future generations. So it's important that we do build more homes. In terms of the numbers, the government's had an ambition to build 300,000 homes a year. We've got nowhere near that. Last year we built 230,000 homes. We built 1.2 million over the last 5 years. That's not bad it's terrible compared to 30 years ago, but it's not bad compared to where we've been recently. But I've got to say that at the moment the numbers are falling quite significantly because there are issues with regards to local authority areas where, because the message has been heard that the current government doesn't want to build any new homes, essentially local planning authorities have down tools and plans aren't being developed, and that's affecting hundreds of thousands of homes. There's the ongoing issue of nutrient neutrality, which needs to be cleared as well, which is affecting areas of the country where we most need homes, and we calculate that's blocking about 140,000 homes that could be built. So there are these barriers that need to be knocked down. Just to put some statistics on that, if you just look at planning approvals, is perhaps one of the best ways to look at what's coming next. And planning approvals for the year are down by 20%. And you can see that because of what's happening in the market, a year or so ago, we didn't really have demand-side issues for developers. But with 7 increases to base rates, with mortgage rates going up, we're getting squeezed at both ends now. And I say we, I mean home buyers. I don't necessarily mean the industry. On top of that, for developers, particularly for SMEs, and I know that there's been a focus at this event for small and medium-sized enterprises. 20 years ago, when I was active in the industry, there were about 10,000 house builders in England and Wales active, building at least one home a year. I calculate that number now is fewer than 2,000. So there's a fantastic opportunity to get SMEs going again. And the reason why they're not in business is because they face all the same challenges as the largest house builders. The biggest single issue is planning. Despite the issues out there at the moment with regards to finance, whether it's development finance or mortgage finance, our own surveys tell us from SMEs the single biggest issue by a long way, despite the backdrop at the moment, it's still planning. Planning delays, planning risk, which is why they can't get on site. Just on housing supply, let's not lose sight of the fact as well that even at current levels, house building generates about £40 billion a year in economic activity. It supports 800,000 jobs. And also something we've been talking about a lot over the weekend is actually the activities of private house building support delivery of about 50% of all the affordable housing which is delivered in England and Wales, which amounts to about £7 billion a year. So there's two huge opportunities there. One is to build more homes for private sale, get more people into home ownership, and with that will come more affordable homes. But also I think there's an opportunity to get housing associations and local authorities building again. And we could talk about housing associations and the challenges that they're currently facing, and those discussions are being held elsewhere at this conference. Just a final point about building more homes is that the homes that are being built now are hugely energy efficient. I know we've got more to do when we're looking into the next step on the way to net zero, which comes in 2025. But the reality is a housing crisis, cost of living crisis, energy crisis has really made it absolutely clear to anybody who's running a home that the costs of new build are significantly lower, potentially saving £2,000 a year. And a new build home being built now to current standards emits 1/3 of the carbon emissions compared to the equivalent existing home. So we're already doing our bit there. So more homes will help improve that. The next bit, just finally, I think, James, is resolving the deposit dilemma. And actually that's now become exaggerated. It's no longer just about a deposit. It's about absolute affordability. So I think just on that, to say that we know that the first-time buyers are having to find, on average, £44,000 to get on the housing ladder. So without the assistance of the bank of mum and dad, that is extremely difficult. It's no secret, and I know we could talk about it, but the Help to Buy scheme was massively successful. It put 400,000 people into homes. 85% of those were first-time buyers. But at the moment, there is no scheme available for first-time buyers, and they're facing all these challenges, and they're unsupported. Now, we at the Home Builders Federation have worked with lenders and a number of our members to put together an offer called Deposit Unlock, which does help to provide a way for aspirational new purchasers to get in there with a 5% deposit. But frankly, it's just not big enough with all the challenges that are being faced at the moment. That scheme is called Deposit Unlock, but we need something bigger, we need something better, and I think prospectively the government needs to enter that space to make sure that people who can't afford to buy homes have got access to a scheme that they can. And there may be limitations on that, and again, happy to talk about what that might look like. So there's many other housing issues that we could talk about. I touched very briefly on retirement housing, and again, our research has found that actually there is an issue here. That 2 in every 3 retirement properties built, if they were to be sold, they would release at least one suitable for a first-time buyer. So if you can get that retirement end of the market going, you are releasing homes for potential first-time buyers. So I think, finally, just from me, that we should be asking all of our politicians and all of our parties to do more with regards to housing. I think that voice is being heard. Home ownership should not be unrealistic and unobtainable. There is an aspiration there, and I think it's our job to do something to get it on track.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Neil. There's loads to get into here, but I'm going to go straight to the issue of supply first. And the first question I'll ask is sort of open to all, but Rachel, I'm going to direct it towards you first, if that's okay. So I think it's come up a few times that the issue of supply is not a recent phenomenon. Arguably, it's been since the 1980s when it comes to social and council housing, but some other people say it's from the 40s and the planning system was introduced after then. Hazel said that this is actually an issue that goes back to the 20s, and the rate at which we were producing new stock has never really recovered since before the war. So I suppose my question is, given that this is such a long-term issue, should we be confident that Labour will tackle the dilemmas, the obstacles, make the decisions that will change this for the better, or are they going to run into the same political problems that parties of all stripes have run into in the recent past?
So I think that's the crux of it, isn't it? And you can't start to fix any of that without acknowledging, as we all have, that there is a serious challenge and we need to build more. And once you've kind of accepted that and stopped saying things like, well, do we really need to? Is there really a housing shortage? You know, that's your first step to getting on the way. It's not just about building houses, the challenges that we've got at the moment. We've also got issues with local residents blocking very crucial infrastructure projects, solar farms, reservoirs, wind farms for some reason that I don't understand, HS2, which we will not get into here, power stations. Yeah, we're all traumatized by that. Nuclear power. Like, there are so many areas where there are things which are very, very obviously for the national good, and our legal system and our planning system enables a very small number of very, very vocal local people who are affected to torpedo the whole thing. And that's why I was quite heartened to hear Rachel Reed today talking about some of the things that you could do to address that, capping the cost for people mounting local objections, great, offering sweeteners to locals. Personally, that gets to me on a real fundamental level. Like, I don't think people should need to be bribed to do what's in the national interest, but if it does something to help, then okay. But I just want to name sort of one other thing that I think is really important, and where I have almost some sympathy with the NIMBYs. I've just been out to mid-Bedfordshire, where, I'm not sure if anyone's noticed, but there's a by-election happening, and speaking to people there about what their local issues are, and they had a huge new town built that I think has 5,000 new homes, which is great, and I went to see it, and it started being built in 2007, and as part of those homes, it was promised a GP surgery, a rail link, extra school places, I think a primary school and a secondary school, leisure facilities, which Hazel mentioned, and basically none of that has materialised over a decade later. And the developers blame the council, and the council blames the local NHS trust, and everyone blames the local MPs, Nadine Dorries. And there's a blame game going on that's been going on for years, and the people who have moved there don't have the services they need, and the people who lived in the area before have seen their already very, very stretched local services just become completely overwhelmed by those 5,000 new homes. So the next time somebody says, oh, let's build a new town, you can guess what they're going to say. And I think getting to grips with that as a policy challenge is also really crucial if we kind of want to bring people with us on this.
I suspect that actually Hazel and Neil want to come in on this. So I'll open it to you two. I'll just say, you mentioned Section 106 and potential reforms to how we levy developer charges. I want to say, how would you do it? And I would say, for your members, the people in the sector who have to pay these duties and have to navigate the labyrinthian planning system, what would they want to see? Are they worried about the uncertainty that would come with a new system? Hazel, maybe first?
Yeah, I think when we first sort of did the Section 106, it was not quite an aspiration or a wish, but I don't think that the detail around it was as robust as it could have been. And therefore that's now allowed some developers, and I don't tar all developers with the same brush, to do a kind of 106 light. And so instead of providing services that are attractive and relevant, and whether it's transport or leisure facilities or whatever, they've kind of got away with as little as they can. And I don't think that that's the right way to have a partnership with the developers, because it's in the developers' interest to build a community rather than simply building houses. And I still worry about this, that because of the focus on numbers, you've got to get the numbers of houses going, then the bits that actually make it worthwhile living in that place kind of go to the back of the agenda. And I actually think that they should be at the forefront of the agenda. Just as you were saying, Rachel, what kind of place do you want to live? How do you want your children to have a play area, or the older children to have a youth club to go to? And that's what makes life kind of worth it. If all you're doing is commuting to work, coming back, you've got nothing in your local area apart from a roof over your head, and a roof over your head is very important, I'm not denying that, but that quality of life. And so I think I've been really disappointed by Section 106, and I do hope that the planning reforms that Rachel's talking about and John Healy are going to be quite tough in terms of, you said, and you need to deliver on some of this. So it's a bit of a challenge, to some of the developers and house builders, because a house is not a home. It's four walls and a few rooms. It's the community that you build makes it worth living there. And I would just say this about in the 1960s, I come from Salford, right? Everything was council housing. That was the only thing basically that was around, and they were going through a massive demolition project in the inner city of Salford. So you had two choices. You could either go miles away from where you lived in a new council-built estate, or you could try and buy your own home. And at that time, my mum did 3 jobs. You know, she worked before work in a cafe, she worked all day at work, and then she had an evening job. My dad worked every hour of overtime you could find. You know, my dad was a shop steward, he was well on the left, but as far as he was concerned, home ownership was the thing that would give them stability, continuity, a stake in the community. It would allow their kids to go to a decent school so they could get on in life. You know, a home is not 4 walls and a roof. It is a place where you build the kind of community that you want to live in and the kind of home you want your children to have access to. So I'm totally with you on this. And if we can't do that in this country, because we've got lots of people who've already got a great place to live and they don't want to share that with anybody else, they don't want to see any change happen, then, you know, that's not the kind of community I would want to live in.
Neil, just before I go to Chris, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, just some really good points been made already. I think with regards to building communities, there's not a developer that you'll meet that doesn't want to play their part. But I think the practical piece that Rachel mentioned in South Bedfordshire is not unusual. It tends to be actually down to whether it's local authority or local support, the local NHS trust. And I can take you to some good examples, and I can show you some places where there's been some problems as well. But all this stuff is provided for up front. And I've seen it work, and I can see the problems. I mean, originally I'm from the north of England, but I've lived in Cheshire and I've lived in Amersham, and now I live not far away from Milton Keynes. And moving to Milton Keynes, which maybe didn't raise my heart at the time, but living there now, you realise it's a type of place where things really happen. When they say they're going to put infrastructure in, it goes in. If they're going to build new schools, it goes in. You don't get developments that materialise without the supporting community, and that's because well-drilled, experienced people working for the benefit of the local community. I think overall, on Hazel's point with regards to Section 106, it is challenged, but I think it's sometimes, maybe even over the weekend, there's been this view that Section 106 operates in isolation, but actually the proceeds from new development, there are competing needs. You know, there's community infrastructure levy. The government's talking, probably one of the things that we disagree on actually, James, is an infrastructure levy, yet another levy. Currently, the house builders are paying an additional 4% in tax, residential property developers tax. There's talk about we're waiting for a consultation on a building safety levy to come as well. There's all these additional burdens which are being carried, and we talked there, I think we all touched on education, and there is with new development comes the need to make provisions for education in the local area. So when all this comes together, unfortunately something may get squeezed, and I think it's good that we're having this discussion about how it all comes together. But Section 106 isn't just in isolation, it's not just about delivering affordable homes, and I think if we could straighten that out, we'd have an idea of how to go forward. And that's maybe part of the reason why, Rachel's point, which is not for this session, is why are we struggling with major infrastructure? Why can we not do the things that we set out to do? Why can we not deliver them? And I'll leave it there. I
should say this coverage of developer contributions is found in this particular paper that we recently published, available online.
Apart from that point, it's very good.
You had that there on the desk.
Someone must have put it there. Chris, I'm going to ask you 2 clipped questions, and then I'm going to go to the audience. I think you crystallised really well in your remarks this sort of private versus social housing. Is there a trade-off? Is there not? So can I just ask you to speak a little bit more to that, and particularly about the right to buy policy, and whether you think it's antithetical to the sort of things that you would like to see in society? And the second question, we know that the supply issue is a long-term thing, and delivering the number of houses that we need per annum is going to be a long-term project. But to quote an economist popular on the left, in the long run, we're all dead. So in the short term, are there interventions that you'd like to be seen in to support first-time buyers in particular, perhaps in the mortgage market? Is there anything we can do in the short term to support, people trying to get on the housing ladder for the first time?
Thank you, James. To answer the first point about right to buy, I'm someone on the left of centre who thinks it's a good thing. My granddad was a miner, Newcastle. He bought his house through the right to buy. My parents bought their house through the right to buy. What's wrong with someone from a working class background being able to buy their own home? This sort of love on the left of thinking it's bad is just some of the most uninspiring and anti-aspirational policies I've ever heard in my life. So we have those discussions, and it ruffles feathers internally. But I think it's got a bit out of hand with the prices the way they are, and the discounts that are offered obviously being prohibitive now because of the disconnect between wages and prices. But we are at a point now where I think if we do get on with building more homes and we do build more social homes, people should be able to, you know, carry on living in their community without having to leave.
Yeah.
On the second point, I mean, there's a few bits on, you know, what can we do in the short to medium term. I'm not a fan of mortgage guarantee schemes. I think Help to Buy was probably one of the worst policies this government's ever done. You know, it's been proven by the LSE that it didn't actually increase supply. So, you know, we've got to really look at the new things. Every country that's wanted to do a mortgage guarantee scheme have wanted to repeal it. You can't have a government interfering in 25% of the market like they do in America. If you look to Holland, they've only just got weaned off 104% loan-to-value mortgages. Is that the country that we want to be back in to be thinking about? So, you know, I don't think intervention in the mortgage market is where it needs to be done. Those lenders allocate their risk on the basis of the person in front of them. The state doesn't need to sort of carry that extra risk. The demand is there. It's not the issue. I think, you know, Labour really needs to start looking at this a bit more sophisticatedly. We've heard Keir talk about being pro-business and pro-union, and, you know, there's been some good work done to date. But if we're going to move forward with this, we've got to really look at what a vacancy rate is. You know, vacancy rates are long-term empty properties longer than 6 months. You look in London, they're like 0.6, 0.8% empty homes. We have these sort of pseudo campaigns about action on empty homes. It's a complete irrelevance in the argument, because the real issue is there's not enough homes being built. So if councils were begun to be targeted on vacancy rates or improving that, or at least increasing their net additional by a certain percentage, we've seen it in New Zealand under Jacinda Ardern, where they reduced the restrictiveness of the planning regulations through upzoning, as it was called then, in Auckland, one of the most expensive places in New Zealand. And it works in lockstep. The supply goes up, I think from 9,000 to like 21,000, hadn't been done in 30 years. And the rents were coming down. And the thing is, when there's, you know, people have more money in their pocket, they can save up to move in to home ownership. So it's got to go hand in hand. I think some of the best stuff that's been announced is releasing Greenbelt. I think we can't have a conversation about house building without talking about releasing Greenbelt, particularly around railway stations. I think Professor Paul Cheshire from the LSE has always been big on this. Russell Curtis, he wrote for the Homes for Britain report, Planning for Growth report. That was launched in March this year with Andy Weston, part of the IMBY movement. He mentioned that as well. So that's going to come forward. That'd be great. I think we do need to move towards a flexible zoning system. This sort of tinkering around about Section 106 with developers. I mean, my Labour mayor in Tower Hamlets, he's no longer the mayor anymore. We had huge amounts of Section 106 still sitting in the bank doing nothing. And, you know, it's got to be, we've got to get tough on the politicians as well as we've got to get tough on the developers as well. So, you know, a flexible zoning system, in my opinion, is probably one of the most, if we're going to work towards a proper planning system where it's rules-based and, you know, politically led. So we have the council leaders coming forward, consulting in the communities as Keir set out. And then that's what the developers have to go and build. It's quite simple, really. You know, the fact that we can't decide what we want up front is just, it's mind-boggling. And what's led to the issues that we've got is that ability to wriggle out. So, you know, the other thing, I think, just that we haven't talked about carbon footprint. You know, there's a report by Daniel Cameron, who advises the Biden administration. The one thing that local governments can do to fight climate change is increasing density around urban transport. It's called urban infilling. And we will reduce carbon emissions. This whole retrofit first nonsense is probably one of the most damaging arguments I think we're also having on the left. Because if we increase density around train stations, if we go up taller, I live in a block of flats. I used to drive out of London in Wembley, where I actually work for the developer. I work in the industry, if you haven't guessed, in the area that I grew up in. And we did have great, you know, it was a car park where you used to have like knockoff bags. It was known for Wembley, outside Wembley Stadium. But then that's been regenerated to one of the most amazing places to live in the country. And, you know, at the end of the day, increasing that density, I used to drive a lot around, and then I moved next to a station, and yeah, I live in a flat, so I'm not, you know, some people have problems with us going up, and families living in flats. I've always lived in flats. And ultimately, if we're able to go up around those stations, increase that density, we're going to lower our carbon footprint, improve your ability to save some money and get on a housing ladder. So I think that's what we can do in the short to medium term.
Very interesting indeed. I think at that point I better open up to audience questions. So if you just put your hand in the air, no question too outrageous, just give your name and affiliation before you ask a question. We're going to take those, let's do three. So the chap in the green shirt, the lady to the right of him, my right, and then the chap here.
Thank you. So I'm Matt Lismore. I live in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, who've done a great job of building more properties. But one of the questions that's been asked is about actual home ownership. I was quite lucky. I bought my first property at 25, which is quite good going in London. But I still feel like I don't really own it. I'm a leaseholder. My service charges have risen 250% over the last 4 years. I'm not in control of my own, quote marks, home. And we heard yesterday about making common hold the default going forward. I wondered what the panel thought about how we could make current leaseholders more in control of their own homes, potentially by giving them the right to take on common hold as well as the new builds. Because obviously there's 5 million current leaseholders that are in that situation. And then the second thing was around the right to buy part. So in Barking and Dagenham, the local authority have actually created purpose-driven limited companies that they've incorporated themselves to develop properties with. And that gives them protection against things like right to buy, because the limited company doesn't have to conform to those local government rules. And I just wondered whether the panel have seen that applied in other parts of the country, and if there are any drawbacks to doing things in that way.
Very good questions. Holly.
Hi, Holly Wright, New Economics Foundation. So I was curious about what was being said earlier in relation to sort of YIMBYism within the Parliamentary Labour Party, specifically Andrew Weston. There's a lot of influence from organisations like Price Doubt and the YIMBY Alliance, etc., who are very much focused on sort of building rapidly, very quickly, and on deregulation. And I was sort of curious as to how we sort of strike a balance if you were to be talking to policymakers within the party between mass house building and planning reform and essentially deregulation, and ensuring that we have that sort of beautiful community that we also want at the same time. Basically, how do we force the developers to do that? Although some on the panel may say that they want to do so naturally. We've seen quite a few, Barratt homes are very ugly. So this is kind of like the thing that we need to be thinking about. Question mark.
Hi, my name is Venus Galarza from Shelter. Just to the point on the right to buy, obviously we're losing 14,000 social homes a year to sales and demolitions. The social housing wait list continues to go up. It's 1.2 million households waiting who cannot get on the housing ladder to own their own homes, who are stuck in temporary accommodation. So I was just wondering, how do you balance, obviously, the two with, as I think one panelist said, that aspiration to own your own home, but not having the savings to do so?
Thank you. So I reckon there's probably three groups of questions there. One is leasehold, one is the right to buy scheme, and the final one is YIMBYism and the beauty agenda. Who would like to take leasehold?
I can speak personally about leasehold and share all of your concerns. And I think having gone through the process of thinking that I owned a flat and then realising at the point of selling it that I very much did not, it's pure rent seeking. And the fact that it has been used as a policy, not just for blocks of flats when there's some justification for shared costs, but for new housing developments and houses, and people being told that they can't put up a shed in the house that they thought that they had bought because the developers own the land for it. I think it's widely misunderstood. I think it's mis-selling. I think it's a scandal sort of on par with sort of financial mis-selling because the information hasn't been there. And the fact that it slips between the cracks because leaseholders kind of, you are a homeowner, so you're not in the problem of not being able to buy your own home, but you have all of these issues, is something that any party that's sort of committed to the security that comes with home ownership should be thinking very hard about. Not a legal expert, not sure how you go about that, but I would stress that a lot of the things that we've seen with things like cladding and in the wake of Grenfell really highlight the problem of when you sell people something that isn't really theirs and where the legal system is very much stacked against them. So tighter regulation on leasehold, more legal support for leaseholders, and an overview, a look at why it is that we in Britain kind of uniquely have such a large part of our market sold in that way, I think is a vital part of the conversation, and I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
I think that's right. I'll choose my words carefully. I'm very receptive to ideas about movement in this area. The only thing I'd say is it's critical that however we go about reform, we need to make sure it's done in such a way that doesn't compromise new supply coming onto the market. And the Law Commission has actually done some really good work on this about how we can do that. Anyone else on leasehold before we get to right to buy? Let's do right to buy. Chris, do you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point to say that the loss of social housing through right to buy in terms of overall numbers is a problem because they're going down, right? But let's be honest, how do we get more social housing? It is through increasing housing supply. The percentage, if we look at OECD averages, the Centre for Cities report that talked on 4.3 million homes, looked at all the other European countries, and we perform poorly on all measures since, I think, the time that Hazel mentioned before, like pre-1945, but the Town Country Planning Act is a key milestone in that. So if you look at Austria, they've actually provided more social homes, but they've also provided significantly more private homes as well, and that's where the 4.3 million has come from. I think, the social housing sector has a lot to answer for as well, to be honest with you. Some of the conditions I've seen knocking on doors in Tower Hamlets of registered social landlords or councils is absolutely disgusting. And the reality is, if we are going to get more social housing, why aren't we looking at allowing private developers to have access to this subsidy? If you go into a development, a private development that's owned by an owner-operator, probably going to get some of the best quality service that you're ever going to live in your life. I mean, I think the other point, just on the deregulation bit, I think if anyone that's actually done anything in planning has looked at a policy document or the regulations and said that is, the deregulation, it's about better regulation, ultimately. We're talking about how do we get the outcomes, the communities, the design that we need. We've talked about design codes. We've talked about putting rules in place that set out what we want. And those things just need political leadership on it, in my opinion. And, the social housing losses, just to wrap it up, is if we built more social housing, if we looked at low-income housing tax credits, another point in the Homes for Britain report, this is how private sector can be funded without borrowing any money to ensure that those rents are set at the average median income, 60% poverty threshold level, at no more than 30% of their income. So there are the mechanisms out there to do it. It's just whether the Labour Party or others that are interested in the space seek to explore it too.
Thanks, Chris. Hazel, I think the beauty agenda is a really interesting thing for the Labour Party. It reminds me a little bit of the choice agenda for Blair, and the idea that choice isn't just something for the well-off in society, it should be for everyone in society. And beauty seems similar. It shouldn't be just something for the well-heeled communities. It should be something that everyone can enjoy in the UK. But how do we go about delivering it?
Yeah, I think I just feel really passionately about this because most of you will be aware of, remember, William Morris, have nothing in your home that you don't know to be useful or beautiful, and preferably both. And so that stayed with me all my life because there is this sense that if you're building affordable homes, then they don't need to be beautiful. And yet who wants to live in a square box, which is boring, dull, it doesn't make your heart sing when you get home from work. It's not got any garden at all. It's got no green space. There's nowhere for children to play. All right, you might have a roof over your head, but that is about it. And I think that we have a right to aspire to something, well beyond that in our lives. And particularly, 21st century, we ought to not just be building identikit boxes. We ought to be building places that are beautiful in themselves, but are also surrounded by all these other facilities. You want a youth club for your children to go to. I chair a social investment business, and we recently, to our great surprise, won £340 million from the current government to build youth centres in every place across the country, and particularly in the most deprived areas. If you can have a beautiful house and a youth centre and some design, creativity, I just want us to be more ambitious, and I'm hoping, I'm sure John will do this, to make sure that when we have design standards, they're for everyone, not just for the people who can afford to buy houses at, the more expensive end of the system. Because if you give people beauty and pride in their homes, you change what happens inside that house in terms of the children's aspiration, the educational outcomes, and everything else. So for me, it's not just bricks and mortar. It's actually the heart of that home and the heart of that community. And if we're clever about it in terms of the design standards that we put in and really work on it, then why shouldn't we? We've got new towns, Milton Keynes, and everybody kind of made fun of it a bit. But actually, if you go there, It's fantastic. It works for both transport, for housing, for community, and for everything else. Why can't we do that?
Quite agree. Should we do another round of questions? There's one here and there's one at the front here, please.
Hello, I'm Katie Kendrick. I run the National Leasehold Campaign. Regarding leasehold, we talk about the aspiration to be the party of home ownership. Leasehold is not home ownership, it's a long-term tenancy agreement. So if we're going to achieve what we say we're going to achieve and actually move away from leasehold, we need to seriously look at building an alternative tenure, which is common hold. It works everywhere else in the world, apart from us and Wales seem to be stuck in this archaic belief that we need to have leasehold. We don't. Leasehold just fuels the builders and the freeholders. It does do nothing for the people that live in those properties, apart from causing absolute misery. So we do need a firm commitment to build new common hold and find a way for existing leaseholders to get out of the rut that they're in. Thank you.
Thank you. And just here, please. Thanks, Miles.
Hi, Robert Luck. I have a housing company called Lattice. Just two points I wanted to make. One is about really land value capture and how that can be utilised to obtain, to enable home ownership through private development. Because I think that actually, call me a cynic, but a lot of the volume home builders, in my view, don't produce homes, perhaps intentionally or perhaps not intentionally, to maintain high prices. And actually, building beyond absorption rates is critical to bring prices down. So first point. The second point really is about supply itself, production itself. And I think with all the will in the world, the traditional construction methodology just won't be able to gear up to build 1.5 million homes in a promise that the Labour are making. And I think that actually it is possible with modern methods of construction and new ways of building. And I think that what are your proposals around that sector? Thank you very much.
Neil.
Yes. Katie, I think there are people on the panel in the room who I think, as Rachel said, you need significant legal expertise to venture into leasehold. But the big point here for me is political will. HBF, Home Builders Federation, is represented on the Common Hold Council with a view to moving that on. But with the turmoil that we've had, 6 housing ministers who co-chair that group in 12 months and the need to make some progress, it needs political will. And it's good that questions are being asked at the moment with regards to where that is heading. Unfortunately, in the meantime, it's creating some difficulties because whilst this is limited to development of apartment blocks, that's a lot of what we're talking about today, and it's what Chris has been talking about. So I think there's some work to do there. But I would agree with James as well that some of this stuff shouldn't slow down development in the meantime, but there's work to be done there. I think the point, if I can just take one more, I think on the point on production is really, really, really key. I think that personally and professionally, supporting those operators who got into volumetric MMC, we've watched them disappear this year because of the lack of certainty. In terms of so much of that is to do with planning delays. There's also market challenges as well. The one thing that really is happening, I would just say, because others will want to speak, is that maybe that's one end of the spectrum. And in the meantime, in terms of vertical integration and the house building industry, the biggest house builders are moving quite swiftly and at scale to using panelised construction, which doesn't mean that the whole of the home is transported on a back of a wagon to a site, but it does mean that the walls arrive in one piece. And that's a really good way of tackling some of the challenges that we're facing with regards to net zero as well, and further improving that quality aspect. So, yeah, it's not been good to have seen the challenges in the last year or so have massively, because of the lack of confidence, it's the same for the SMEs I talked about earlier on, the lack of confidence in the market, ongoing planning delays, unfortunately, have had an effect there.
Anyone else that's come on that?
Yeah, sure. I think on the leasehold problem, I mean, I'm a leaseholder. I was a shared owner. I've actually been fortunate enough to transition across. You know, the last Labour government did introduce common hold, but it wasn't formally adopted because of the resistance within the UK finance market, so the mortgages and all that sort of stuff. They didn't understand it. Now, as you pointed out, quite rightly, that other countries do this quite fine. You know, you've got American condominium models and others. I think the reality is that I understand the Labour Party are wanting to move towards common hold. What can you do about the existing leaseholders, including myself? I think we're all going to be a bit screwed, to be honest, because the amount of ground rents that are linked to the existing leasehold system that is in our pension funds, in our you know, all of that kind of stuff. For the government to bail it out, it would be a huge hit to a lot of people's pensions. So they're in this catch-22. I don't think anyone's been brave enough to kind of point out the obvious, but people that are in existing leaseholds with ground rents, like myself, dealing with terrible service charges that you have no say over. I mean, as a shared owner, couldn't even when we tried to do a set up a formal resident association, the regulations wouldn't even allow you to be a qualified tenant because you weren't even a leaseholder, you were an assured tenancy. So I think the campaign, the Common Hole campaign and Common Hole Now campaign is doing valiant work. I think there's a long way to go. I think in terms of helping the future people that are going to be moving into these apartments, there needs to be focused on getting those people with the mortgages, getting them lobbied to try and make a difference. I think on the point about MMC, the points well made there is we've seen I've lost count how many sort of volumetric home builders have gone bust. Now, if we're not planning for enough homes, these people can't get the volumes they need to sustain that level of output. So the MMC is linked to planning reform, and we need to make sure that we are building enough homes. I don't think 300,000 is enough. It needs to be near 500,000 at the very least. And you know, I think what was the other point that you made about supply? But land value capture, yeah. So on the land value capture, we capture loads of land value through developer contributions as it is. I think, you know, there could be more instrumental ways using tax incremental finance around to fund new infrastructure. But ultimately, you know, to the point made earlier, if we keep taxing, we're just going to raise the costs, and that reduces viability. We need to be looking at ways we can, you know, get more built in more areas. Because at the minute, with the interest rates the way they are now, 5.25%, whatever it is, build to rent's not viable. You know, just where the build costs are at. You know, and we really need to think about increasing the supply. To the point, there's a lot of volumetric home builders or larger house builders who they have a sales model. But if you had more SMEs and all that sort of stuff building as well, then they would all be taking those assumptions. Now, the issue that we've seen is with that neutrality, where Labour did fumble it, was not working cross-party with the Tories on dealing with that neutrality. Because I tell you what, the amount of SMEs that are going to go bust as a result of that decision by Labour to not back that position is going to be totally counterproductive to when they want to come into power and need to push them on. So we've just got to make sure that the parties working with the industry in the right forums, and you know, maybe through the HPF or the LPDF or any others, and working, you know, in lockstep to make sure that those mistakes aren't made going forward.
We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to close. But that point about neutrality sort of gives me a chance to go back to the first question I asked Rachel in her closing remarks. On that occasion, when we wanted Labour to step up and deliver on something that would lead to more homes, they didn't. Are you optimistic? At this conference today, are you optimistic that Labour can do the things that are required to be done?
So I think that was the wrong call on nutrient neutrality, and I think playing politics with housing is not the way to solve this problem. I would say, though, that the Conservatives have absolutely been playing politics with housing, and the development's blocked because of where local MPs are. So it's not just Labour Party that's doing it. I am optimistic, though, because that target, to go back to where you started, that 70% home ownership target, it's very bold, it's very ambitious, and it says where the party wants to be in terms of its value and its positioning in society and across the generations. Reaching that is another matter, but just saying that that's where they want to be, I think, as a statement, is really important. And I would hope that once they're in power, they're able to make, what was that phrase? Long-term decisions for a brighter future?
Hazel, 30 seconds if you just want to say anything to wrap up.
I was just going to do tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, or whatever kind of platitude I could come out with there. I do think the MMC point is really important. These youth centres that we're now building right across the country, we're doing a huge amount on MMC, because otherwise we just never get them done. You know, the kids would have grown up by the time their youth centre was on the ground. So, you know, I think that all political parties should be encouraging MMC wherever they can, as part of the investment on all of that. I do think that the paper that John Healy's actually done is quite bold in terms of, you know, what the vision is for housing. I was quite impressed with it and encouraged by it, because, you know, in the past, housing's kind of been somewhere down well, not at the bottom of the agenda, but way down, when you look at the health service and other things. And now it does seem to me that housing has really gone up the agenda, and particularly what we were saying about people in London, it's just impossible to get your foot on the ladder. So I would, the thing I'm encouraged by is you're going to have this OBR on ministers. Good job, I'm not a minister. Because they're going to get monitored on the promises that they've made in this paper, which is very bold, right? And if they don't deliver them, it's going to be very public about what's happened and what hasn't happened. So I think it's quite brave of John, and also to have a department for housing rather than mixing it up with communities and everything else. Obviously, people live in houses, but I think that will give an extra push to the commitments that are being made.
Thank you, Hazel. I've really enjoyed this panel. A few thank yous at the end. One to Oscar Bickett for letting me overrun by 5 minutes. Very sorry. But also to our panellists and HBF for sponsoring this event. So if you can join me in a round of applause. Thanks very much. Thank you.